Meditative spirituality is awesome, but one legendary monk tells us how our lives go into hyperdrive when we link this to a continual conversation with God. Welcome to 5-Minute Spirituality, a look at how the great spiritual masters help you enjoy and thrive in your life right now. My wife Grace will be joining us a bit later. So if meditation in its pure form is about being still and letting thoughts go, my introduction to mystical faith was the opposite. It was about discovering a God out there who seemed to be wanting to get my attention. As an 18-year-old amateur atheist debater, I was not open to arguments about God. But in my first few months away from home in college, I got discouraged, and coming off of a fresh debate with religious people, I suddenly wondered if they might be right. What sounded appealing to me wasn't so much, then at least, the idea of a God who would change anything, but more of a God or a being or whatever who might give me perspective. And so I prayed for the first time since I was really young. And I had sort of a crazy night that seemed to have several uncanny answers and responses. I was rooming with a smart, kind atheist at the time. He and I had been paired because of our atheism. So I didn't want to tell him about this. And so I went out each night for walks in which I tried to keep whatever had happened going. I signed up for classes on Sufi Islam, Islam's mystics, I was told, and modern day Judaism. I read up on the major Eastern religions. And each night I would take these walks and try to connect with whatever was going on out there. I would, in my thoughts, say something like, "Hey there, universe. How's it going?" And I would try to sense any response, and then I would just go from there. And it took. And when I started hanging out with Christians, I found that some of them were kind of excited about my story because of this thing evidently they had wanted that I seemed to have stumbled into that they called two-way prayer, and that I came to call chatting with God. I discovered a really helpful historical model, a monk named Brother Lawrence, who lived in France in the 17th century. He was not a big shot at this monastery. He was not the leader, say. Instead, he worked the kitchen crew. But he became a name because of his interest in this one verse in 1 Thessalonians. Rejoice always, pray constantly, give thanks at all times, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. He particularly wondered, how was it possible to pray constantly? Didn't people have to concentrate on all sorts of things each day? Conversations, tasks, whatever. But he gave this a shot for a decade. And then suddenly he tells us it got easy for him to maintain what he called a continual conversation with God. And whatever happened to him became so attractive that people came from all over Europe to learn from him. And they wrote down what he taught them into a book called The Practice of the Presence of God. So what he did is kind of what I tried to do. Here's a bit of advice from James chapter 1 about this. If any of you lacks wisdom, James writes, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Well, that's a big promise, and one that almost immediately seems to get disqualified for everyone. Because who, trying to ask God's wisdom and listening for an answer, doesn't doubt whatever one senses? So the key, James seems to be saying, is running with whatever you sense as if it's actually God's voice to you and seeing where it gets you. It's practicing what in my playwriting days we might have called a willing suspension of disbelief. And that's what Brother Lawrence did practice all those years. And that's what I was working on during my walks. Now you might be wondering how this sort of chatty engagement with God goes together with meditation, which is again about letting thoughts go. If you're struck by this, my encouragement is to do both and ask that question yourself. At the very least, my practice each day involves meditation in just the sense we've talked about. And then it also involves this sort of conversation, both. And the pleasure of that is that one's contemplative spirituality gets imbued with care from a living God who loves you. So Grace, finally your turn. How has this worked out for you?
I guess I'm not especially strict with myself during my 20 minutes. I usually seem to start off well, coming into God's presence, being still before Him, enjoying Him. But as the time continues, I often will realize at some point that my mind has wandered off into other thoughts. And then I will come back to God using the sacred word that I feel like He gave me. But sometimes I'm in God's presence and I'm having thoughts or questions toward Him or I feel like he's saying things to me and I'm responding to him. And that's all okay. I think that's good. So I don't know if that's what other people mean when they talk about centering prayer, but I'm just saying that in my practice of it, it doesn't have to be silent in the sense that there's no thoughts or words. Sometimes silently, I may be having a really meaningful exchange with God, and I appreciate that.
So why don't you give this a try today, either on a walk or sitting still or journaling. Grace often likes to journal in this fashion. And give a shot at the James chapter 1, ask for wisdom, but don't doubt that you'll get a response from God advice. That's it for today. Next time, I'll get a little more big picture and hope that you like such things. We're going to look at this 4-part understanding the spiritual masters have about what we're up to with spirituality at all. I've been really helped by this. And if you enjoy 5-Minute Spirituality, you might also enjoy a lively weekly podcast on these things called Journey On with Dave Smelser, my name. And Grace and I also host a weekly, vibrant online group with people from all over. To learn more about that, shoot us an email. See you soon.